and conventional food. What's the difference in food composition? And then I will, as I go through those differences, always try to explain a little bit where those differences come from. What is it down to? What in the organic agronomy is different that makes a difference to food quality? And then I'm going to say a little bit about the two main questions that we got after we published our meta-analysis. The first one was, yeah, okay, we accept there's differences for nutritionally relevant compounds, but is there evidence for health benefits from organic food consumption? Does it actually make a difference when you eat the stuff? And the second one is, but what about yields? And the interesting thing for many of you may be that the thing that I am completely convinced about is that with respect to yields, the approach that organic farming or agroecological farming takes is really the only approach that will fulfill the Brundtland Commission's objectives for sustainable development. Because with conventional farming, we are satisfying our needs now, but we're not leaving anything for the next generations. And that point I want to make at the end of our talks. Whether or not and how big the health benefits from organic food consumption are, we haven't measured yet. And you will see that also from the talk. There's lots of indications that it will make a difference, but it hasn't been measured yet. It hasn't been quantified yet. That's something the scientific community still need to tackle. Okay, so let's go through those four questions, or the scientific evidence that we have to answer these four questions step by step. So are there significant differences in nutritional quality? And here we really rely on the evidence of systematic literature reviews and meta-analysis. What is that? Well, the meta-analysis is basically a scientific study where you take the data, all the published data, on composition differences between organic and conventional food, and you calculate percentage differences on the data from all these studies, and then you basically, in simple terms, make averages. So you average all the known information. It's a bit more complicated than that, but in principle, that's what it is. When we did these meta-analysis, we used three different types of studies, because people had studied composition differences with three different approaches. The first approach people took, and I should say each of these approaches has its positives and its negatives. Okay. So the first approach that people had taken, taken to study this was to use so-called basket studies or retail service. Basically, you go to a shop, you buy organic and conventional bananas, you measure the content, and then you report your results. Okay, the good thing about those studies is you know what the consumer really gets when he buys organic and conventional. The bad thing about these studies is you don't know whether you compare organic versus conventional or Panama versus Colombia, because you don't really can allow for where these things have been produced. And the environment, as you all know, is quite important for food quality and food composition. The next type of study that people have used is so-called farm comparisons. So they went to a group of farms that worked to organic principles, to a group of farms that worked to conventional principles. They bought their bananas, and then they went to the lab and they analyzed again, and then they looked at the differences. The benefit is, usually these farm studies looked at farms in the same area, so any sort of confounding factors related to environment were greatly reduced. But they were not completely abolished, because as you know, you can grow bananas on lots of different soil types, and soil type has an influence on the food quality. And then finally, the third approach, the so-called controlled field experiments. That's where you remove any potential environmental factors as much as you can, because you grow your bananas in exactly the same field, just one half is organic, one half is conventionally managed. You harvest your bananas, you go to the lab, and you look at the differences. But the problem with those sort of studies is the difference that you measure could be due to the difference between organic and conventional in just that one location. It might be completely different when you go to a different country, or to a different soil type, or to a different climate. So they all have their advantages and all have their disadvantages. So one of the things we always did when we did these meta-analysis, we looked on whether study type had an influence on your result. So we looked at studies which have their deficiencies in different areas, but we looked on whether there were any big differences based on study with type as well. And for most of the results I'm presenting you today, there was basically where we had all three study types represented in the evidence, they showed pretty much the same trends. Okay, we used only data from peer-reviewed studies in the statistical tests, so that's a principal control measure. Some other academics had a look at these studies and evaluated them. That didn't mean we leave a lot of evidence out. I mean, most of the evidence, I would say 98% of the evidence was actually peer-reviewed evidence, so we didn't disregard many data. But as a sensitivity analysis, we repeated the analysis again with everything included, and again, that didn't make any difference to the data because only 2% were non-peer-reviewed. And we carried out so-called weighted and unweighted meta-analysis. And I want to explain a little bit what that means. Okay. So weighted meta-analysis, that's the type of meta-analysis the statisticians feel is the only ones scientifically sound. Because it grades and in its statistical model it weighs the studies depending on how big they were. So obviously we included any study that had more than 3 comparisons in it, but there were some studies that had thousands of comparisons in them. And they, in a weighted meta-analysis, have a bigger influence on the overall average than that study which only had 3 samples in it. And the other good thing about the weighted meta-analysis, you use the variation that is described for the individual studies in your statistical algorithm. So you are thereby more sure that statistically you're not describing variation but really a treatment effect. You can be much more sure that you're describing the effect between organic and conventional than anything confounding. Okay, the unweighted meta-analysis we basically carried out mainly because that's what most people before us has used. And that would then allow people to compare what we have found with what they have found. But there is actually, for some data, there is some point in doing that. And I explain to you why. Okay, the statistician field is less scientifically sound, and that's certainly true with respect to pure statistics. Because basically you weigh that 3 data point study exactly the same as that 1,000 data point study. So that is certainly bad about it. And it doesn't consider measures of variation. Okay, so your confounding effects may be picked up rather than your real treatment effect. But what it does allow is it allows you to include the results of studies where the study itself hasn't measured the variation. And the sad thing is, a lot of scientific studies don't. Okay. They might report the p-values, but they don't report the variation on individual comparators. As a result, for certain parameters, there is a lot more data available for an unweighted meta-analysis than for a weighted meta-analysis. And when your weighted meta-analysis only has 20 data points or so, then an unweighted meta-analysis which has 80 data points may actually give you a better measurement of the real difference. And that's a reality for a few of the parameters that we have measured. Okay, and as I said before, most of the studies that had been done before us, including that really bad study that the Food Standard Agency in the UK sponsored, which basically included a very small number of studies, lumped meat, milk together, numbered all the crops together, on a very small number of studies and then concluded that there was no difference between organic and conventional. Okay, so let's start with the crops. The big differences were on antioxidant content, cadmium content, and pesticide residues. The big surprise was the cadmium. We had data from 343 peer-reviewed papers, and as you can see, a lot of the evidence in the late 2000s. So a lot of time after the Younger et al. Food Standard Agency study had reported. And they didn't even pick up everything that was available at the time when they stopped their literature review. They've only included 46 papers, but that was papers on crops, meat, and dairy. In an area that is so variable, that is not enough to do a meta-analysis. And if you look at the type of commodities that we found data for, most of them were for vegetables, fruit and grains, and much less on any other crops. But it's a substantial database. Let's have a look at our first primary assessment. We only had identified 3 primary assessments, which was antioxidant activity, heavy metals, because organic farming had been criticized for using manure, and that would result in higher loads of heavy metals in the foods, and pesticide residues. For the weighted meta-analysis, we had 66 data points. For the unweighted, 160. You can see how big the difference can be. And for both, we had a very, very high p-value. So these are very significant results. So we're 99.99% sure that our assumption is correct. Coming to some explanatory assessments, we looked at the antioxidant compounds that the nutritionists are interested in detail. So these are all nutritionally relevant compounds, and for all but one, we found exactly the same result: higher levels in organic crops compared to conventional crops. But the numbers we have for individual antioxidants with respect to the data available for meta-analysis are much lower. I haven't included the individual data sets here. And here, for the first time, we see big differences between a weighted and an unweighted meta-analysis. So in these cases, what we're doing now, we couldn't do at the time because it was too much work and we didn't have a budget for it. We are writing to all the authors that have not included their measures of variation and ask them to give it to us, so that we can get a more substantial base for what is a better statistical test. Okay, so what are these antioxidants and polyphenolics? I want to just summarize that very shortly and very broadly, because I'm not a nutritionist. I can't describe you all the evidence base for this in detail. But antioxidants are basically compounds that neutralize free radicals and thereby prevent cell damage in our bodies. And there is increased evidence that consumption of foods rich in antioxidants results in a reduction of a range of chronic diseases, including cardiovascular disease, certain cancers, and neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's. And these plant-based polyphenolics are the most abundant antioxidants in our diets. So basically, there's more and more evidence that this is one of the reasons why eating a lot of whole grain, eating a lot of fruit and vegetables is good for us, which is, incidentally, one of the few things all the nutritionists agree on. And if you want to have more detail, I would advise you to read these recent reviews. They're quite good. Okay, then the big question is why? Especially in academia. Nobody believes you if you can't explain your results. Okay? So, and there we come to evidence which we had actually collected before we did the meta-analysis. Okay? So we had a contract from the EU to look at the reasons for differences between organic and conventional foods even before Dunga reported his incredible results. And these we have obviously published now, that we had made the point that there are significant and relevant differences between organic and conventional foods. And they are mainly from long-term experiments at Nufferton Farm. That is where I work. And the farm is a big estate, 320 hectares. Half is managed with conventional farming practice, half with organic management practices. But the comparisons we made were not between the organic and the conventional half. That's futile, because you change so much when you go towards organic farming practice. You can't explain anymore where your differences come from. So we could quantify differences, but we can't explain them. But what we have done is we started in 2000, when I started at Nufferton, we started 2 long-term field experiments. In fact, this is a group of 4 experiments, and then that is an additional experiment which we started some years later. So 12 hectares are now in long-term field experiments. And in these field experiments, we included in the experimental design every agronomic factor that differs between organic and conventional systems as an experimental factor. So we started with rotation. So our main plot is a conventional rotation, which is a detail here. It's very cereal dominated, winter wheat, winter barley, then a break crop, potato, vegetables, winter wheat, winter barley, 2 years grass clover. We're a mixed farm, so we always have grass in the rotation at Nufferton. And that's quite typical for the north. And then the organic rotation, that is something that everybody had advised us, and all the organic sector bodies agreed on that, for once. That is something that we should do from a commercial, but also from a diversity point of view, which is basically to introduce more vegetables into the rotation and potatoes, so that's winter wheat, potatoes, vegetables, spring beans, so some legume again halfway through the nitrogen depleting crops, potatoes, vegetables again, but crossing over, spring barley, and then 3 years grass clover. It's a very intensive organic rotation, but it is diverse. And it is quite typical for someone who has a market for vegetables. Okay, so that is only our first factor, that's only our main plots. And that obviously changes over the years, but in certain years we can compare the same crop in different rotational backgrounds under the same climatic conditions. Then our subplot is 2 types of crop protection. Basically anything that's permitted under organic crop protection standards. So we use mechanical weed control, we use copper as a fungicide for our potatoes, and that's it. We use netting for our brassicas. And conventional crop protection, basically we use the same cocktail of pesticides that the IPM system that our conventional half of the commercial farm uses on our plots. And incidentally, in the north of England, that doesn't include real pesticides, it doesn't include insecticides. It's mainly fungicides and weed killers. And then we split the plots again into an organically fertilized plot, which is composted manure, and a conventionally fertilized subplot, which is NPK fertilizer as we would apply it on the commercial half of the farm. And we do that for both the organic crop protection and the conventional crop protection. And by organizing the experiment this way, we can not only tell you exactly what the main effects of these 3 factors on food quality are and on yield are, we can also tell you about the interactions between the factors. Whether the effect of fertilizer is different depending on how you protect your crop. Whether the effect of fertilizers is different depending on which bit of the rotation you grow your crop in. And it's these interactions nobody had really ever investigated well. And one other thing we were interested in is to really look at the relative impact of environmental factors and agronomic factors on food quality. And again, you can only do that with an experiment like that. But in order to be able to do that in a reasonable time frame, because remember, going through the rotation once takes 8 years. To do that in a reasonable time frame, what we had to do the same experiment 4 times and start it in different ways. Okay. Can you imagine being an agronomist working on that field trial? Yes, exactly. That's what it's like. And what I should say, there is 2 guys running this. 2 guys running this and have run it for 16 years without making a mistake. Because when you make a mistake once, you don't get your beta read in once, then the experiment comes to an end. That's for my 2 colleagues, I assume. Yeah. Okay, and this is what it looks like on Google Earth. Experiment 1, each experiment needs to be replicated 4 times, and that is just what the statistician wants. But then the same experiment is replicated 4 times. And you can see it's a different color scheme in every experiment because that experiment is at a different point in the rotation, so it has a different color. Okay, results. But I thought I spend a bit of time explaining the experiment so you know where the results come from. And the interesting thing for antioxidants was that we always only found a main effect of fertilization, except for one exception. There's always one exception in biological systems. One exception. Okay, now that is very, very different to the explanation that you find in a lot of statements in the literature which said, oh, of course there is more antioxidants in organic, because there is more spoilage in organic, and that's when fruit express antioxidants, because these are also resistant compounds. So, of course, if they don't use fungicides, there is more disease on organic apples, and you have more antioxidants. Well, that basically is something we have never in all our experiments and all the crops we looked at found evidence for. And if you think about it, it's an irrational argument, because apples which have even this tiny little lesion on it will not enter the food chain these days. Yeah. So you don't get that to measure when you make these comparisons. Okay. Incidentally, we never really found evidence that there is more disease in our organic crops either. Okay. And I explain a little bit more why that might be. Okay. We might have different diseases dominating, but we never found really more disease in our organic crops at Newcastle. Okay, so we only found a main effect of fertilization. That's why I'm only showing you the main effects here. When you compare with and without pesticides, no significant effect. When you look at NPK fertilization versus organic fertilization, a significant effect. This is glycosinolates, this is why your mother tells you to eat your cabbages. Okay, that's a good thing in a cabbage and other brassicas. We look at vitamin C in potatoes. Potatoes are, a lot of people don't know that, quite a good source of vitamin C. It's again the fertilization. So when you switch to compost fertilizers, or I should say it's the other way around, if you use mineral fertilizers, your antioxidant content goes down. This is the exception. It's lettuce. In lettuce, we found a significant effect of crop protection. In conventional crop protection, we had lower concentrations of antioxidants. So that actually disputes that hypothesis that you have more problems, more disease problems in the organic lettuce, and that's why you have more antioxidants. No, you have less antioxidants when you use the pesticides. And here what you're looking at is a residual effect of the pre-emergence herbicide that you apply to lettuces. They have a short vegetation period, so even a pre-emergence herbicide applied to our lettuce crops still affects the carotenoid levels, which are very well known to be affected by semi-selective herbicides. So that carries on until harvest. You probably don't find that in other crops because the distance between application of your herbicide and harvest is much longer. Okay, don't worry about this slide. It is quite easy. It is quite easy. This is the output of what they call a redundancy analysis. But it's actually quite simple. What you do, you have a computer program into which you put the data on all the potential factors that you have measured that might influence your antioxidant content. In this case, it's in wheat. So this is all data for wheat. So we know that radiation has an effect on antioxidant contents. We all know that because we know that tomatoes, which have been grown in the Mediterranean, have more antioxidants in them than tomatoes we grow in greenhouses, unless we use artificial lighting to a very large extent. Okay. So radiation we use. So we measured radiation in our field experiments. We measured relative humidity. We measured soil temperature, air temperature. Temperature is also known to have an effect on your antioxidant contents. And then we added what we knew we had done with respect to the agronomy. So organic fertilization, compost, mineral fertilization, pesticides used, pesticide not used. And then we also included all the index half-life in things like ledet. Okay, that brings us to the third primary assessment, that's pesticide residues. And you would have expected there to be a lot of information. Well, it isn't. Nobody is bloody measuring it. And people, oh, sorry, I'm wrong. No, everybody's measuring it, but nobody is analyzing it. Yeah. There is no reports on the average pesticide residue levels in organic and conventional. On the market, there's only one big study, which I would say is a scientifically sound study from America. Just one on something as important as pesticides. That in itself is quite an interesting fact that we came up against. So we can actually only provide you data from a meta-analysis which looked at the frequency of residues. And there, I mean, as expected, you would expect a lot more in conventional. But there were too few studies to look at concentrations of pesticides. In the one or two studies where we have data, the data in conventional crops were 10 to 100 times higher. Now it's tempting to say, well, that indicates that the few residues you find in organic crops tend to be spray drift or cross-contamination from neighboring conventional fields. But you have only two studies putting that claim on. So this is an area where we've decided we will do more primary research. That it's bloody expensive. It costs £500 per sample to have a residue analysis done in a reference lab. Yeah. And these guys, you only have one reference lab per country. They hold a monopoly on basically overcharging you. Yeah. So it's very, very difficult, but we are doing it at the moment. So why is the frequency of pesticide residues lower in organic crops? Well, they are prohibited for use, and it seems as if organic farmers stick to the rules. Okay, so that's a relatively simple explanation. But we really need a lot more data to underpin this, and we need to quantify the concentrations that get into the food chain properly. Okay, so in summary, nitrogen fertilizer use is responsible for the low antioxidants, although modern varieties of cereals, we don't know that for other crops yet, may well contribute to it as well. Mineral phosphorus fertilizer use is responsible for high cadmium content, and we also know nickel from our own studies, and pesticide use is responsible for high pesticide residues. And in some cases, slightly lower antioxidants that are related or affected by herbicides. That brings us to milk. Milk, we have a lot of evidence, and the evidence base is even more solid than for crops. And for milk, we can calculate, and this is the only commodity for where we can calculate the impact switching from organic and conventional has on actual intakes. Remember, in crops, we threw all the crops into one meta-analysis. We haven't got enough for individual crops. If we don't have data for individual crops, we cannot multiply that by intakes of specific crops and get to what difference does it make to intakes of these compounds. Okay. That's a big deficiency if you want to sort of model what that might mean for health. That's something you have to keep in mind. So we need a lot more analytical data before we can actually model the effect on, potential effect on health. But for milk we can do that. The data are very substantial. We can even say that the difference between organic and conventional has become bigger over the years. Okay, so the data sets are really good. And the differences are in a different area. They have to do with fat composition. So you have more beneficial fats in organic milk. And this applies to total polyunsaturates, but that difference is relatively small. The biggest difference is for omega-3 fatty acids, conjugated linoleic acid, and there is smaller differences also for some of the antioxidants in milk. But there's also lower iodine and selenium in organic milk. Say a little bit more about that. So we have 170 papers on cow milk, a lot less for sheep and donkeys and whatever else we extract milk on. So we did it mainly on cow's milk. We also done a study on meat, and in meat, I should say, our evidence base is small. Okay. So for a lot of compounds, we are not able to make big statements. And especially when you look at how much you are left with when you split it up into different commodities. And we all know that the composition and what affects the composition of beef, pork, lamb, and poultry differs quite a lot. Yeah. Then we have to say the evidence is limited for meat. We need a lot more information before we can be sure of quantifying those differences. So I will only focus on where we are sure about the difference being significant, but the relative difference, the quantity of difference, you have to take with a pinch of salt. So where we are relatively sure is definitely for milk on omega-3 fatty acids. You can see they are 60% higher. And we are pretty sure about that being significant difference in meat. We actually have a little bit more evidence for that particular parameter in meat. But the variation is much smaller for milk. Okay. Explanatory assessments, again now, other composition differences in milk. So we have differences for some of the antioxidants and conjugated linoleic acid. We have a lot less iodine on average over all those studies in organic milk. We have a little bit more iron and we have a little bit less selenium. I will focus on omega-3 fatty acids and iodine because they are nutritionally most relevant. These other differences are relatively small. I say a little bit about CLA as well. So omega-3 fatty acids, I think all of you have seen them. It's a recognized compound, food compound, also by consumers now. And they were linked to a reduced risk of diabetes and heart and cardiovascular disease, especially the longer chain omega-3 fatty acids. And we have that difference for both alpha-linolenic and the longer chain fatty acids. And they're important for nervous tissue development, so pregnant females are advised to have a higher intake of them because they help the child's brain development. And that is pretty well founded. I mean, we have nutritional recommendations as to omega-3 intakes. Conjugated linoleic acid is also a polyunsaturated fatty acid. That has been linked to reduced risk of obesity and cancer, to preventing heart disease, and to improving immune function. But I should say, the evidence is mainly from in vitro and animal studies. So the dietary intervention study showed a small effect on obesity, but not the massive differences that were detected in animal studies. Okay. Iodine, this is where you had a lot less in organic milk. That's an essential mineral for thyroid function and brain development, and again, especially during pregnancy and early life. So you need the omega-3 fatty acids and you need the iodine during pregnancy, and the recommendations are to increase intake during that period of time. And most terrestrial foods are low in iodine because our soils are low in iodine. It's a little bit different if you sort of farm near the coast because the seawater spill gets you a little bit more iodine into the soils. The only foods rich in iodine really are fish, seaweed and dairy products. But there is also recommendations not to have too much fish and especially not too much seaweed while you're pregnant. For other issues or for other problems that you take in with them. Iodine fortification is therefore widely recommended and used. And we fortify either table salt, that's the WHO recommendation, World Health Organization recommendation, which most countries do as a matter of routine in the world. So most countries try to increase iodine intake by fortifying table salt. And milk. And in some countries like the UK, you're trying to get your iodine up purely by fortifying milk. And fortifying milk is done by fortifying the mineral, by using mineral supplements for concentrate feed that you give to your animals, and in particular dairy cows. Okay, now the problem with iodine is that your optimum intake levels are relatively close to excessive, unhealthy intakes. And that is a real problem if you put all your money on two particular ways of fortifying your population. And in fact, at the moment, or over the last 20 years, we have used increasingly iodine for teat disinfection and as a mineral supplement in livestock production, especially dairy cows. And that has resulted in excessive dietary iodine intakes in certain population groups. And at this moment in time, EFSA recommends to reduce the permitted levels of iodine supplementation of livestock concentrate feeds. So at the moment there is more concern about too much iodine going into the food chain via milk than too little. And I want to show you that problem with a graph that one of my students has prepared as one of her projects, which I thought was really quite good. What she did is she looked at the consumption of milk in the United Kingdom, in Finland, the European Union overall, and the United States. Finland being really an example of a high dairy intake country. Okay. And you have to remember that even in the UK, iodine intakes from other dietary sources than milk accounts for more than 50%. Okay. So what people get is 50% more than what these bars show, or twice as much as what these bars show. Okay. So for Finland, this conventional milk, you hit the excessive intake at average dairy intake. Remember, dairy intake varies quite a lot between people. If you are a non-vegan vegetarian, you have a very high dairy intake, yeah, quite often, because you like cheese and stuff like that. So here, putting in a country with high dairy consumption, basically both organic and conventional gets you above the level recommended for pregnant women. And if you drink conventional milk, you go above this threshold of excessive intake. For the UK, with organic you stay just below that recommended intake with organic, but you get above with conventional. But where should you set the level for iodine? Should you set it at the level required for pregnant females, and then everybody else has to take that as well? That is a difficulty with respect to recommendations for dairy supplementation. Now in the UK, this was all calculated based on the data from our meta-analysis. But in fact in the UK, the organic farmers have increased mineral fertilization so that they get to the same level as the conventional farmers. Okay. And I think in Norway, it's pretty much the same. So those countries, like the UK, which don't use fortified table salt. Yeah. In the UK, we don't use iodine table salt. If I want to get it, I have to go to an internet supermarket to buy it. It's not available. Their milk consumption, how much milk you drink, becomes your primary driver for intake. And we have a big problem in that young females, teenage girls, don't drink milk because the wrong nutritional messages got out at one point and they think they get fat if they drink milk. Remember, the milk we mainly drink in the UK is milk where we've taken the fat out. The iodine is still in there, but they still don't drink it, and then it's not actually the pregnant females. They eat iodine supplements because that's what's recommended. Okay, so that's the difficulty with iodine. Is it good or bad that organic has less on average? Well, that really depends on your dietary and your fortification background. And I thought I'd spend a little bit more time on that because I think it's quite an important issue in a lot of countries, getting that right at the moment. Okay, a few other differences in meat. In meat we had slightly lower concentrations of two saturated fatty acids that were clearly linked to an increase in coronary heart disease. Remember, the message coming out at the moment, it's not saturated fat per se, it's particular fatty acids that are responsible for an increase in coronary heart disease. Okay, coming back to the question why. Why do organic milk and meat contain higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids, CLA and vitamin E? And it is nearly all due to feeding. If you feed a cow grass, it has more omega-3 fatty acids and antioxidants in its milk. And it's not just fresh grass. If you conserve the grass, that has also a very good effect on your omega-3 fatty acids. Whereas concentrate feed, your cereals and maize silage have a negative effect on omega-3 fatty acid concentrations in milk. What I show you here is a very interesting study we did in the UK, in Wales. In Wales you have not just organic grass-fed systems, you also have conventional grass-fed systems. And you have conventional systems which have an indoor period, a long indoor period, and feed a combination of grass and concentrate feeds. And as expected, since it's all due to feeding, when a conventional farmer uses exactly the same diet, basically grass only, then he has nearly the same amount of omega-3 fatty acids in his milk as a certified organic farmer, because he doesn't do anything different except for two things. He applies a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer, not much, at the beginning of the season, and that results in a slightly lower clover concentration in his swards over the whole period. And this difference is due to that difference in clover, because clover pushes your omega-3 fatty acids up more than just pure grass, but it also reduces your CLA concentrations in the milk by roughly the same amount. So you have a slight shift. But basically, it's all down to what you feed. Fresh forage and conserved grass, hay or silage is good, and feeding maize is bad. And that you can see here again, the driver fresh forage, the driver grass silage, that pushes up the omega-3, the CLA levels. It also pushes up your antioxidants in the milk. Okay, but genotype also has an effect. And we studied that. So it's just like in crops, what variety you use is important. And just as in crops, we found that there is an interaction between the type of cattle you use, in this case, a yield-selected US brown Swiss versus a traditional brown Swiss. Brown feed is the name in Switzerland for brown Swiss. The traditional genotype, which stayed on the pastures, was never selected for yield a lot in Switzerland. That is able to make a lot more omega-3 out of a pure grass diet than your yield-selected brown Swiss. And incidentally, if you put them on that much grass, they also have the same milk yield. Okay. So if your diet is right, the difference in yield that you get on a high concentrate diet goes away. Isn't that interesting? But that has only been done for that particular genotype of cow. Okay, so in summary, outdoor grazing gives you the high omega-3 fatty acid levels in the CLA, also raises your PUFA, your vitamin E, and your carotenoids. When you have the cows indoor, grass, clover, silage, and hay is better, and traditional breeds also have a benefit, especially in dairy cows. Whereas maize silage and concentrate feed, maize cereals, that results in higher omega-6 concentrations in the milk and higher concentrations of unsaturated or saturated fatty acids in meat. Okay, so coming to the first but. The first but I think I definitely have time for. I don't know whether I've got time for the second but. But the first but is there evidence that organic food consumption has a positive effect on human health? Well, yes, there is some evidence from human cohort studies, and they give you an epidemiological view on whether certain diseases are reduced in people that consume organic foods. But there is currently no scientifically sound human dietary intervention studies. And really, it's these dietary intervention studies you would have to do before you can make a health claim, before you can go out and market organic food as being healthier. And the difference between the two is, in these epidemiological studies, you rely on what people tell you that they eat. Yeah. You can do that well or you can do that badly, but you rely on what people self-report. Whereas in these dietary intervention studies, you make sure they eat a certain thing. And then you measure them regularly. Okay, so what is known from human cohort studies? So organic food consumption was linked to reduced risk of a few conditions. But what I should say is every study that I could find showed that there was an impact of organic food consumption. There were always very weak impacts, just about statistically significant or just about associations. But every study that I found included here, there's a couple of studies which I don't think are scientifically sound, showed that. The first one was a study in Holland which shows that eczema goes down in young kids when the family eats organic dairy products. A big study in France and Belgium showed that overweight and obesity goes down even if you correct the data for lifestyle. Interesting thing is people who eat organic food have a better lifestyle. For starters, they have a better diet, they do more exercise. All this obviously affects obesity and overweight, but even if you correct for that, you have this effect, and it's a big effect, 40% on obesity. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is the one cancer in a UK study, cancer UK study, that was shown to be associated to be reduced, associated with higher organic food consumption. Overall, that study showed that there is no difference in cancer incidence. The study only monitored over 7 years, and I don't think that's enough for that sort of study. But even in that short period, it showed an association with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is obviously the one cancer that people have found to increase associated with exposure to glyphosate. That's why glyphosate was recently, that's one of the reasons why glyphosate was recently reclassified as a probable carcinogen. Preeclampsia here in vegetables, you know all about that study that was done here in Norway. And again, there is now 2 studies which linked a reduction in hypospadias in baby boys and sort of genital misformations that need to be corrected surgically to increased vegetable dairy or dairy fat in case of the Danish study. So that's what we know. Not enough to quantify, but a good indication and certainly a reason to look a little bit more. I would like to do what about yields. In fact, that is my most important bit. Can I have another 10 minutes?
Actually, your time is almost up also with about questions. So, do you manage in 2?
I'll try. But I can't promise. Okay. This is a bit I'm convinced about. Because the way we produce food in conventional farming doesn't satisfy the Brundtland Commission objective of sustainable development. We are satisfying our needs at the expense of what we leave for next generations. That's what we all do at the moment. Okay, yes, organic farming has lower yields. This is a result of the most recent meta-analysis. But the yield difference is not that big. There's some commodities like fruit, where the recent meta-analysis says there is no significant difference between organic and conventional yields. But on average, 25 to 30% lower yields. And certainly for cereals, that is reality overall at this moment in time. Vegetables, this is mainly skewed by potato data. For a lot of vegetables, you are in this area, but for potato, you're certainly here. Okay, that's the reality now. So why am I convinced that organic farming is the way to go? And that comes from what we know, we all know, the conventional sector and the organic sector knows will limit food production in the future. And that is initially the cost, and then the availability of phosphorus, potassium, water, and nitrogen fertilizer, which is very much linked to energy consumption. And I want to say a little bit more about that. And pesticides as well, because again, 20 to 30% of energy use is down to manufacturing pesticide in agriculture. Okay. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. That means we're all mad, or is there some economists in the room? Okay, right. But they are mad by definition, I suppose. Okay, and this is the reality of conventional food production. Since 2000, the main commodity crops have not shown any increases in yields. Now let that sink in. But everything else is still exponentially growing, including population. In fact, if you go back and look at this period here, that 40 years between 1960 and 2000, where we had not an exponential but a linear increase in yields, how did we achieve that? Well, we achieved it by massively increasing non-renewable resources, or increasingly scarce resources, nitrogen fertilizer and phosphorus fertilizer in particular. And pesticides, we've only started using 40 years ago. These are non-renewable resources. I just want to show you how stupid we are just on our farm in Netherton. You have to remember that to produce 1 kilogram of nitrogen, you have to use 1 liter of fuel, or the equivalent in gas or coal. Okay, so we do it with gas at the moment, the Chinese do it with coal. That results in 2.38 kilograms of CO2 equivalents being released into the atmosphere if we use our favorite nitrogen fertilizer, which is ammonium nitrate. That's what we use at Netherton. We produce 50 hectares of wheat every year, and we apply 200 kilograms of nitrogen to that. That means that we use 10,000 liters of fuel, or the equivalent in gas or coal, and we release 23,800 kilograms of CO2 into the atmosphere just by growing the wheat crop on one UK farm of 123. Globally, we use 120 million tons of nitrogen fertilizer annually. Massive amounts of fuel used for that. And 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are purely due to manufacturing. That in the future. Now, when I bring this up, the head of the UK Farmers Union says, yes, I agree, But we will have enough energy in the future. We just build more nuclear power stations. No, and guys, yes, that we can do. It will leave a different type of mortgage. Okay, they don't produce as much greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah? But we're trying to build them to do something that reduces them. Okay? And we are leaving the spent fuel rods that will last and be a contaminant for millions of years. Okay, but it's even worse than that. The way we use these inputs has become less and less efficient. I just want to show you that on the basis of nitrogen. So this is our increase in yield. This is a green revolution, a doubling in yields per unit area. But it's not really per unit area, because we also take a lot more land into productivity. Yeah? So an increase in yield is doubled. But we're using 4 times as much nitrogen fertilizer. That means we're needing 4 times as much input to produce a kilogram of grain than in the 1960s. It's absolutely mad. Because people who say we can have more for less, they're trying to beat the law of diminishing returns, which is one of the basic rules of economics. You can't beat that. But I think he might be right, we can do that. But one thing we can't do is we can't make more phosphorus fertilizer. And that is the mineral that we will run out of first. I can't tell you exactly when. The estimates are from 50 years from now to 300 years from now. Yeah. But who are we of using up, this is one of the middle of the road estimates, who are we to use up at least a quarter, maybe a third, in just 40 years, when this took millions of years to accumulate in the soil, and when we have no way of generating new deposits, or getting it out of the oceans again, where it eventually moves into. Who are we doing that to our next generations? So what will happen if we lose the phosphorus as an input in conventional farming? Well, there is also the law of minimum that we're trying to beat if we say you cannot substitute one mineral for another. Yeah? So however much, so this is usually shown by this barrel bar, where the water level represents your yield, the plants represent your individual nutrients. And basically, however much calcium, magnesium, potassium, sulfur, and nitrogen we apply, if the phosphorus is at the minimum and decreasing in our soil, then that will determine our yield. Okay, so what will happen? This will happen. This is our increase in fertilizer use in Germany, because I have good statistics, and this is the development of winter wheat yields. Up to 1980, organic farming already has reached these yield levels, which are incidentally higher than the average US winter wheat yields at this moment in time. Yeah. So organic farming has already reached 5 tons per hectare. If we lose the phosphorus fertilizer, within 10 to 20 years, depending on the soil and depending how we overloaded the soil with phosphorus in previous years, we will be down to the yields again that we had before we started using phosphorus fertilizer in conventional farming, unless we do exactly the same that organic farmers do, which is recycle it via manure and any other organic waste. Now, I take any conventional soil scientist trying to challenge me on that, because that is true. That is what will happen. I cannot say whether this will happen in my lifetime. I've got the big suspicion that it might do. Yeah. But it will definitely happen in my children's and grandchildren's lifetime. And remember, what gets scarce initially gets more expensive, but at that point we are already. Where I farm, where I have my olive yard, the conventional farmers now want my manure from their neighbors, because I can't afford the nitrogen fertilizer anymore. Okay, I'm nearly there. So the main approaches we have is we have to recycle this stuff. And we have to use any type of waste, including our own waste. And this is where my big criticism about organic farming comes. We are not allowing this to be recycled at all. We're not saying we only recycle it if it's sound. We're saying not at all. This is why we can't say at the moment we can feed the world. We cannot unless we recycle all waste back into agriculture as fertilizer. We need to improve our breeding, I'm nearly there, and we have to reduce reductions of losses from fertilizers from soil. And you can all start by reducing the pressure on crop production, by eating less animal products. I'm not saying eat no animal products, I don't believe in that, but by eating less animal products. A 20% reduction in the amount of livestock products you eat results in 50 to 100% less crops having to be produced, depending on the livestock species. That's how big, in the developed world, livestock product consumption affects the pressure on crop production. Okay? And there is hope. There's hope. The latest meta-analysis on yield said the good agricultural systems, the good organic systems, the diverse organic systems, the yield gap is less than 10%. I think that's an optimistic assessment, but I think that's possible with a lot more investment into research and training going into that sector. And we have reached 9.9 tons per hectare in the north of England in winter wheat production. This is an agroecological farmer. This is one who doesn't do input substitution. Yeah. A very good farmer in the north of England. And he got protein quality that year for bread making. And then just the conclusions. I leave you to read my acknowledgements. And thank you very much.